Good evening, everyone. Perhaps I should do a slightly slow intro to give all the people eating outside a chance to slowly gather. But I won't stretch it out too much. Thank you all for being here, especially with this threat, this unknown threat from out from the north that we're just not used to here. I know it comes every year, and every year I'm a little mad about it. I'm Brian Franklin. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History. You may be wondering, why is this guy up here again? Where's that Jeff guy? I've seen him on TV. Our director, Jeff Engel, is working really hard on a Fulbright Fellowship in Austria over the next 6 months. Much suffering being endured, I'm told. And so he will not be with us in person for the next semester, but he is with us in spirit and sends his greetings from some, amazing market in Vienna. I don't know. Exactly, right? Everyone, I will collect your letters of condolences and mail them en masse to him so that he knows you miss him. Thank you all for being here tonight. I thought I could just take a chance to talk about just a couple of things we do here at CPH before I introduce our distinguished guests for tonight. The first thing that I want to highlight is something that we just started last fall. It's a fund in honor of actually our very first postdoctoral fellow who just passed away this last summer, the Aaron Crawford Memorial Fund. Aaron was an amazing guy, a really great scholar. After he left CPH, he got his PhD at University of Tennessee, came to CPH for a few years, and then went off to work on the papers of Andrew Jackson and the papers of Martin Van Buren. Before that, he had worked on the papers of Grant and Polk, and between his work here with the George W. Bush administration, that made him kind of conversant in the deep archival paperwork of at least 5 presidencies. He passed away, and one of the things we wanted to do is honor him by creating something that he would have really loved, which is a fund to help graduate students go do the kind of archival work that he loved so much. And so if you are looking for a good place to give, or you're wondering, how do those graduate students go and do all that work? I thought grad students were poor. The answer is they are. And the answer is, how do they get to go do that work? It's through funds like this, which allow them to travel to the archives all across the country and sometimes across the globe for many of our students. And we would just be so thankful if you might consider giving to that fund. Also, I want to just make sure you know we've always got events coming up, and I want to just promote the next 2 that we're going to have in the next few weeks, really. So on March 4th, along with the Clement Center for Southwest Studies, the George W. Bush Library, and the Friends of the SMU Library, we're hosting Ben Johnson for his new book, Texas, An American History. And really the thrust of the book is Texas has, it isn't just in our imaginations, those of us who are everyone in here probably is a Texan at some level. It doesn't just loom large in our imagination, but actually has played an outsized role in many ways in American history, and that's kind of the story that he is telling in this book. We're really looking forward to that. I would encourage you to sign up sooner than later because it's filling up rapidly. People like Texas around here, apparently. So I encourage you to sign up. That's on March 4th. And then on March 6th, we are co-sponsoring an event down at the 6th Floor Museum downtown that is going to be sort of co-led by one of our postdocs, Elizabeth Reese, who did her doctoral degree at Oxford and is now a postdoctoral fellow with us. She works on the development of the Office of the First Lady from the 1950s up through the 1970s. And the event they're having down there is a documentary screening of a new film called Shaking It Up: The Life and Times of Liz Carpenter. Liz Carpenter was a journalist, a political activist, a proud Texan, and maybe is most well known for having been an aide to Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And after JFK was murdered here in Dallas, she was the one who wrote LBJ's statement to the press that he would give immediately after taking the oath. So our fellow Elizabeth Reese is going to help after the screening of the film and leading a discussion between the director of the film and Liz Carpenter's daughter, who will be there. And they'll be talking about journalism, Carpenter's legacy, Lyndon Johnson, and all the things swirling around that. So you're welcome to sign up for that. It just won't be here. If you come here, you'll probably be in an economics class or something. You won't be at that event. Now, let's talk a little bit about tonight. Tonight is our second annual CPH Book Prize lecture. We award the CPH Book Prize annually to a distinguished first book in any aspect of U.S. presidential history, broadly defined. And this is meant to highlight great work that's being done in the world of presidential history, work that touches on the history of our nation, the history of executive power, the history of our nation as part of the international community. And in particularly is meant to highlight a great first book, right? A scholar who has written their very first book. And our committee receives submissions from presses all over the country and the world, and works through all of these books to work together and come to a decision on this is the best book. And we get an opportunity to award that author with this prize and to welcome them to come and speak to us here. And last year's committee was overwhelmingly supportive of this book being the winner of this prize. Dr. Sheyda Jahanbani and her book, The Poverty of the World, Rediscovering the Poor at Home and Abroad, 1947 to 1968. Hopefully you've already seen this because you saw it outside, but if you didn't, we would encourage you to buy a copy. Dr. Jahanbani will be here afterwards as well to be able to sign and talk with you a little if you have further questions. The committee just loved this book. I could give you many quotes about it, many summaries of what's in it, but you would rather, I'm sure, hear from the author herself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheyda Jahanbani.
I would gladly give up 10 minutes of my talk to hear more about how people like this book. No, I'm teasing. Good evening, and thank you all for coming out on this incredibly cold night. I'll admit, I was hoping for a little bit of warm weather. I came in from Lawrence, Kansas, up north. We've had a really bitterly cold few months in Kansas, so I was kind of dismayed when I saw the forecast. But I shouldn't have despaired, because Texas hospitality always makes sure that you feel warm no matter what's going on outside. So I've been so graciously welcomed here, and that includes your presence here tonight. About that hospitality, I do want to be a little bit specific. I want to express my gratitude to the staff and fellows of the Center for Presidential History, especially Rana Spitz, who organized this visit, including keeping tabs on me as I drove down from Lawrence yesterday. She was being very caring and making sure I stayed on a good, calm schedule and didn't rush and slip on the ice. It was wonderful. Thank you, Rana. And I know that you, like me, are missing my friend and colleague, Jeff Engel. His leadership of the center has been so extraordinary, and we hope he's enjoying his schnitzel or whatever it is he's eating, strudel, and the hard work he's doing, of course. But Brian Franklin has been a wonderful host in Jeff's stead. I also want to thank Ashlyn Hand, who introduced me to a bunch of fantastic undergraduates this morning. What a lovely day I've had. I also really have to share my deep, deep appreciation for the recognition that the center has bestowed upon this book. Writing a book, especially in the discipline of history, is really a rather lonely affair. On the bad days, you can hardly imagine anyone being interested in the subject, which, if you're being honest, has even grown boring to you. And on the good days, the good ones, you think, oh, maybe I am writing for an audience of someone other than my mom and dad. And maybe they will be intrigued by my findings and maybe even mildly entertained by my storytelling. On the very, very best days, however, and these are days you never let yourself imagine when you're actually writing, you get an email from someone whose scholarship you respect immensely, telling you that your book has not only been read by people you are not related to by blood, but has been honored with recognition by your peers. March 18th, 2024 was one of those days I received a message from Jeff to inform me that I'd won the Center's Distinguished Book Prize. I was and remain stunned by this honor, and I want to thank the committee for reading all of the excellent books that were submitted. But I also want to thank Diane and Hervey Pitty, whose generous support makes this recognition possible. So these days, the headwinds are really strong for those of us who research and write in the humanities, and gifts like the ones that they have given to this center really provide crucial shelter and sustenance. So thank you again. Okay, with all that out of the way. So after spending too many years researching and writing this book, I began, as the publication grew closer, to nurse an anxiety that I had never contemplated while writing it. I hoped that I would have opportunities like this one to share my work with people like you. But I began to worry that some of those people, some of you, might expect that I would at least glancingly offer ideas about solutions to the problem of the poverty of the world. And as you probably know by now, historians as a genus don't really do solutions. We are not solution-oriented. We are very skilled at critiquing other people's solutions. That's like our thing. We love doing that. Using archival data, we labor to provide empirically based analyses of why things didn't work, or why they were the wrong things to try in the first place, or why, even though they might have seemed kinda sorta okay at the time, they had dreaded unintended consequences. That's one of our big catchphrases. But except for Woodrow Wilson, and indeed perhaps because of his example, we try to avoid proposing anything that could even suggest a hint of a specific solution to a political or social problem vexing our own times. We take responsibility for the past, for getting the past right. That's our mission. But we are very, and I want to emphasize very, not responsible for the future. That's just not something we are interested in. That said, I am one of those people who does believe that history does hold deep wisdom for thinking about how to solve contemporary problems. Some people might say, as my students often do, that this is because, quote, knowing our history prevents us from repeating the mistakes of the past. Yet, based on my survey of recent global and national errors, I don't see much evidence for that conclusion. I don't think we do this to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past because we are humans, and we all do the same things over and over again, knowing they will not lead to different results. Rather, I hew to a different theory of why history helps us think about the present and indeed the future. We don't learn about the past to avoid repeating its mistakes. But instead, as the wonderful French historian Natalie Zeman Davis wrote, we learn history to remember that astonishing things are possible. So here at a moment in our country's history, and certainly at a moment in the history of the presidency, in which many of us are overwhelmed with a sense of uncertainty, no matter how we feel about what's happening, I want to offer you a story of an astonishing thing that happened in hopes that it might fire your imagination as you think about what kind of world you want to be part of building. Okay, so here is the astonishing thing. In the middle of the 20th century, at a time of unprecedented affluence, the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world at the time, took as its mission the eradication of poverty, an age-old human scourge. And for a time, the most zealous advocates of that undertaking, who were stalwart figures in the Democratic Party, succeeded in persuading two presidents to divert significant national resources towards pursuing that momentous objective. This is, in our era of relative ideological sterility and kind of political churlishness, I would say, an astonishing thing. Perhaps you agree. I didn't always see it that way, though. And maybe, as I'm saying these words, you're also feeling a little skeptical. That shouldn't be astonishing. The least that the world's richest country could do was take care of its own people. Or you might say, if you know anything about the history of the war on poverty that the United States declared in the 1960s, well, that wasn't much of a success. So how does that tell us anything astonishing? I began this project with the same certainties about both the moral imperative of poverty fighting and indeed about the failures of the war on poverty. But it was an unusually candid line in an authoritative scholarly history of poverty fighting in the US that first kind of shook me from those certainties. About mid-century American efforts to fight poverty, the political historian James Patterson observed that, quote, "It's easier to assert that poverty became a subject of national concern than to explain why." Patterson, in that book, did not offer an answer, and really, as I read more books about the history of poverty fighting, it seemed that few historians did. And so challenging myself to take up Zeeman Davis's call to search the past for moments of astonishment and surprise, rather than with an attitude of despair and cynicism, I tried to come up with an answer. And the book that CPH has recognized is essentially my 350-page answer. So I'm going to try to summarize it here so you don't have to read every word. Okay, so I've offered you some sense of the question that guided my inquiry. Now I want to share some of the answers that I discovered. So what I'm going to do is, in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try to tell you the story of how what we might see as a moral imperative became a national policy program. I'm going to start with what I think is a very evocative moment in 1964 that I hope will help you understand how at least I began to piece together the clues that I found. And then I'll offer a brief narrative of the conclusions that those clues led me to, and finally, I'll try to offer some ways that I think this rather astonishing history can help us think about bridging the gap between our dreams of a more just world and the realities of our own fraught historical moment. Does that sound good? You with me? Okay. So almost as soon as I began researching this question of how and why the US government launched a war on poverty in the 1960s, a curious pattern emerged. Far from the narrow domestic social program that critics and historians described, the war on poverty had all sorts of odd international connections. I didn't know what to make of them, but I knew that they were surprising. And so I started taking notes and following these little surprises whenever I found them. So to show you what I mean, let's do a little time traveling. So arriving in Washington, D.C. on a bone-cold night in late January 1964, almost 60 years ago, all that the usually indefatigable Sargent Shriver could think about was some time off from work. Shriver, who was the primary architect and director of his brother-in-law John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps, the signature foreign policy program of the Kennedy years, had just completed what I think we can only see as a sort of manic tour of program sites in Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, Jordan, Nepal, and Thailand. Sprinkled in among Shriver's meet and greets with volunteers and local people, he met with kings, presidents, prime ministers, and even got an audience with the Pope. A hands-on administrator and a devoted servant of the Kennedy family's political ambitions, Shriver had spent the gray months since Kennedy's assassination in the previous November. He had been personally tasked by Jacqueline Kennedy with planning the state funeral, working nearly around the clock. And the end of the year brought no respite. He had a job to do to preserve the slain president's memory. He felt that responsibility very deeply. So as soon as he had seen his family through what was a grief-stricken Christmas, Shriver turned his attention to that trip around the world. He was worried that the foreign leaders who had invited the program into their countries would see in Kennedy's assassination a sort of loss of commitment on the part of the United States to the Peace Corps. He thought that they would lose confidence in the program's survival. And he believed that a personal round-the-world trip would be a powerful way to enshrine the Peace Corps as the living embodiment of Kennedy's legacy. As a reward for his exhausting but he felt successful month-long sojourn for the Peace Corps, Shriver had promised himself and his truly indomitable wife, Eunice, who was then 8 months pregnant with their fourth child, a long vacation, which for the Shrivers meant 9 days. The day after he returned from that round-the-world trip, he had intended to be on a flight to Palm Beach with his family. On his agenda, he actually made notes about this, was nothing more strenuous than reading the latest Jean le Carré spy novel, smoking some of his favorite contraband Cuban cigars, and chasing his 3 children around the pool. But the White House car waiting for him on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base on that January night made those promises impossible to keep. He insisted, because he was more scared of his wife than he was of Lyndon Johnson, on being taken home that night. So he was. And he asked for a few hours to reconnect with his family before he had to talk to the president. Johnson called at 6 o'clock in the morning. So he found himself on this phone call, and it's a remarkable piece of political theater. You can hear it on the tapes that they have over at the Johnson Library. So Shriver had hoped in his heart of hearts that this would be a congratulatory call. He knew that some tension had grown between his other brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, and he very much wanted to find a way through that incredibly complex thicket of personalities. And so he hoped that this was maybe a kind of, a kind of pat on the back from the president. No, the president had a different request. The incomparably persuasive Lyndon Johnson wanted Shriver to plan and administer his just-announced war on poverty. It was a program that did not exist yet, but Johnson had announced it in his State of the Union speech a couple of weeks earlier. Shriver had seen some tiny little mentions of it in news reports that he got while he was on his trip, but he knew it wasn't a program yet. It was just a line in a speech. So to Shriver, the whole conversation he was having with Johnson seemed utterly ludicrous. To assuage the notoriously touchy president, Shriver explained that he already had a job that he loved. He was deeply devoted to preserving and extending the Peace Corps. And he promised, because he was a canny politician himself, that an expansion of the Peace Corps would redound to President Johnson's re-election campaign later that year by attracting more young voters who perhaps, and he put this in a very diplomatic way, did not quite seem as enthusiastic about Johnson as they had about the young Kennedy. And he tells Johnson, you're the one who saved the Peace Corps back when my brother actually got tired of thinking about it. And he said, this will shine so brightly, not just on Jack's memory, but it will just pay such dividends for you in November. Well, Johnson easily shrugged off Shriver's efforts. He wasn't firing Shriver from the Peace Corps, he said. He was just giving him another job. I don't do a Lyndon Johnson, so you'll have to imagine this in your own head. If you can't run a $100 million program with your right hand and a $1 billion one with your left hand, you're just not as smart as I think you are, Sarge. So deploying the treatment for which he was famous, including a characteristically vulgar insult to the size of Shriver's equipment, LBJ parried every objection Shriver could muster. And one of my favorite things about this phone call is you can hear Shriver, you hear Johnson, and then in the background you hear Eunice Kennedy. So here we have this nice man stuck between two truly titanic personalities. So the battle for his vacation, his independence at the Peace Corps, and to some extent his future political aspirations was well and truly lost when you can hear Eunice say, "I think you have to do what the president is asking." Feeling the last vestiges of fight bleed out of his prey, Johnson, who I think probably heard Eunice say that, triumphantly boomed, "Sarge, you are Mr. Poverty at home and abroad." As Shriver tried one last futile time to say no, Johnson lowered his voice. "I want you to get rid of poverty. So the Sunday papers are going to say you're Mr. Poverty, unless you got a real compelling reason, which I haven't heard." Shriver had no such reason. So rather than the vacation he was hoping to enjoy, he spent the next 2.5 years commuting back and forth between his desk at Peace Corps headquarters in Lafayette Park, where he spent Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and his other desk at the Office of Economic Opportunity on 19th Street. He was found there on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and despite his deep faith and belief that even the Lord took Sundays off, he was there on Sundays too. Indeed, he did become the commanding general of what many of his staffers began to call their global war on poverty. Okay, so in its basic contours, this story is not unlike any, thing that we've heard before about Johnson's gifts of persuasion and the reluctant assent that his victims often gave to him. Yet when I first heard the recording of this exchange, it struck me as more than just another uncomfortable conversation between Johnson and one of his marks. Why, I wondered, did Lyndon Johnson, who did understand policy as well as politics, insist so adamantly on the consonance between the activities of the Peace Corps and those of his proposed war on poverty? Why would the head of an overseas public diplomacy initiative be such an ideal candidate for this enormous domestic social program? What if, rather than simply exploiting the talents of his best administrator, as many histories of the period suggest, Johnson's offer to Sargent Shriver reflected something bigger, something more ideologically significant? So to answer these questions, I continued my research. As all the historians in the room know, that's what you gotta keep doing until somebody forces you to stop. And at every turn, I found stories like this one, these odd moments of coincidence, or, kind of, again, these surprising episodes. So I'm just gonna give you a handful of examples that I go into much greater detail about in this book. So there was a social scientist named Oscar Lewis. He was an anthropologist. Some of you may remember him. He was a best-selling author. And he coined this term, the culture of poverty, in the 1950s, that became a really central concept to both elite and popular notions about why poverty persisted. And it turned out Oscar Lewis wasn't a sociologist of poverty in the United States. No, he was a theorist of what contemporaries had started calling modernization and development in Latin America. He didn't ever do field work in the US. It was always in Latin America. I learned about the economist and liberal political activist John Kenneth Galbraith, who focused then Senator John F. Kennedy's attention to poverty as a serious domestic problem in the 1950s, who experienced his own discovery of poverty, as he himself narrated in his best-selling The Affluent Society, not in the United States, but in New Delhi and in post-war Europe before that. There was the story of the writer and political activist Michael Harrington, whose 1962 Jeremiad, the Other America, became a best-selling tract on poverty in the US. Everyday people read these books. And, it supposedly inspired Kennedy's decision to ask his chief economic advisor to develop a policy, a poverty program for his doomed re-election campaign. And Harrington, in that book, didn't use the language of his own socialist political tradition or even the New Deal. Instead, he called the poor in the United States an underdeveloped country within the nation. Finally, at an institutional level, it became clear to me that Shriver's own Peace Corps and War on Poverty functionally erased distinctions between poverty at home and abroad by deploying volunteers to do the exact same kinds of community development projects around the world and urging young Americans to work in both the domestic and overseas units of what he called his volunteer army. So these connections between a domestic social program and the world, they might seem relatively obvious or perhaps even unimportant. But noticing them led me to a bigger insight that helped me answer that guiding question about why the United States declared a war on poverty. What became apparent by following these examples was that the war on poverty that the United States declared in 1964 was not the product of an upwelling of interest in domestic social reform or even Lyndon Johnson's nose for political advantage. Instead, as my research helped me see, it was the result of 3 decades of focused organizing by what is ultimately a relatively small community of American liberals within and adjacent to the US government. And their mission was to reframe the national purpose of the United States around the imperative of fighting global poverty. So the astonishing thing that happened wasn't just that the president declared a war on poverty at home in 1964, but rather that a devoted lobby had emerged within the Democratic Party, starting as early as 1941, to make poverty fighting around the world the raison d'etre of the nation, both in its foreign and domestic policy. In the process, these activists eroded long-held certainties about what caused poverty as a social problem, reframing it not as a national problem, but an explicitly global one, but articulating that the United States, unlike any other nation state, was uniquely qualified to solve that problem. So with the basic contours of the narrative in place, let me offer a little bit of support for these claims. So the story that I sketch out in the book, it starts from a place that was pretty obvious to my historical subjects, but that has since dimmed in its significance in our historical consciousness. So I want to time travel again, and this time we're going to go back a little further. So it's the spring of 1945, and John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist by training, and as he called himself, a committed Roosevelt man, had been hired by the US Army to study its strategic bombing campaigns in the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. Just 2 days after Franklin Roosevelt's death shook the nation, Galbraith strapped his 6-foot, 8-inch frame into a Navy transport plane for a trip across the Atlantic. His working conditions at Army headquarters at 20 Grosvenor Square in London proved uncommonly luxurious, as he commented in letters home. Fashionable Mayfair had been hit during the Blitz, but it had never been officially targeted. Indeed, if you walked by Claridge's or the Connaught, these beautiful old hotels in Mayfair, you could fool yourself into thinking that the Barbary Lion still stood fiercely astride the globe. The lobbies of those hotels, however, revealed the secret to their survival: Americans, and lots of them. Americans were everywhere, and they had money to spend. The immense US military headquarters at which Galbraith arrived, it teemed with vigorous bodies, abundant food, clothing, and materiel. Among my favorite little archival finds was a letter that a young woman who'd been hired as a secretary there sent home, in which she described in excruciating detail all the things she could buy at the store. You could even get fig Newtons if you wanted them. Now, what Galbraith knew is that the vigor of these bodies and the health of these people and the abundance of these goods was not found in similar abundance anywhere else in the world after nearly 2 decades of war. And indeed, beyond Mayfair, the city of London was in shambles. Its bedraggled people were bone-weary from depression and war. In addition to the Blitz, which Londoners had endured at the beginning of the war, V-2 rockets had rained down on the city until the winter of 1944. Indeed, the last one had fallen just a couple of months before Galbraith arrived. The destruction of 100,000 homes and the damage to 1 million more meant that many Londoners lacked reliable shelter. And that spring, ration allotments for clothes, household textiles, and shoes had been cut to half of their 1942 value. Owing to the shortage of wool cloth in England, this is after the war, boys under 12 were prohibited from buying long trousers, forcing them to face the damp chill of an English spring in short pants. Perversely, Germany's surrender in May only deepened those shortages. Within a few months of Hitler's death, Clement Attlee's new Labour government imposed even more strict rules for the distribution of bacon and lard, which had been the 2 staples of Britain's wartime diet. So imagine, as London's housewives watch newsreels of Allied troops tearing down the battlements of their vanquished foes, and for some really rather shocking interval of time afterwards, the only protein they could rely upon in any decent supply was rabbit. Western Europe was now poor. This poverty made a deep impression on Galbraith. Traveling across Germany, he was astounded by the wanton destruction that he encountered. Every building was an empty, roofless shell, he recalled. It was an utterly sickening sight. Less than a decade earlier, in early 1938, he and his wife had spent a month in Berlin, enjoying the delights of one of the world's most advanced industrial societies. They passed their time in, quote, museums, galleries, palaces, and restaurants, and in the evening, the music halls and cabarets. The city's glow, he said, had been enchanting in those pre-war days. And as he readily admitted, the shadows of Nazism were then a little too faint for 2 American tourists blessed with Anglo-Saxon names and white skin to observe. This Berlin that he went to in 1945 was a very different place. As he later recalled of his tour of Germany's ruins, I remember thinking that on the day the world ended, it would look like this. While Galbraith was shocked by the poverty of post-war Europe, he was even more astounded by the scope of America's vast new power. Its military force and political influence were omnipresent. Again, just like the lobbies of those hotels, Americans were everywhere. Galbraith wrote to his wife from Bad Nauheim, "Kitty, you can't see those men and machines roll out without a tremendous sense of awe about what the United States is. I never realized what it is." What Galbraith and his generation of liberals realized was that the United States in 1945 was not just a powerful country, it was the world's superpower. And this wasn't just an anecdotal observation. By 1945, an industrial titan that had been brought to its knees just a decade earlier by the Depression had passed through the crucible of economic catastrophe to become the richest country in the history of the known world. In that year, the US possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, 3/4 of its invested capital, half the world's supply of shipping, more than half of its manufacturing capacity. 1 out of every 3 objects constructed by man or machine on planet Earth in 1945 was made on American soil. And unlike so much of Europe, its home front was unscathed. 500,000 surfaced roads and 250,000 miles of railroad track were available on which to transport people and things. The United States had laboring men too, a resource in especially short supply in Europe. Less than 0.4% of the US population had been lost in the war. Think of how that compares to the tens of millions of Soviet men who never returned home from the battlefield. While the war had enriched the United States, it had also impoverished Europe. Germany, France, England, Italy, and all the rest had lost railway lines, roads, bridges, canals. Factories had been blown to smithereens. Where houses had once stood, only rubble remained. But it was the human toll, of course, that was the most staggering. Some 36.5 million Europeans had died, and among those that survived, food was scarce and hunger and illness rampant. Seeing what, in Galbraith's phrase, the United States was in 1945, he and other liberals who inherited the post-war world faced 2 problems. First, they wanted to ensure that Americans embraced their new global responsibilities instead of shirking them as a previous generation had done. And second, they wanted to use American power to build a different kind of global order in which American-style democracy and prosperity could flourish across the globe. This was the challenge that liberals like Galbraith believed that their hero, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had left for them. And at the heart of that challenge, they believed, was solving the problem of poverty. So starting in the 1930s, Roosevelt had begun to tie economic prosperity to national security. Roosevelt really had been the first to articulate that the rise of Nazism did not owe to the primal forces of racism, but rather had their roots in the social and economic dislocation caused by the Depression, the feelings of despair and hopelessness felt by the forgotten men of the world. Poverty, Galbraith and his fellows came to believe, was the cause of war. This is now a kind of conventional wisdom that we hear politicians often use. And it really has its origin in this immediate sort of World War II moment. The United States, they believed, had to use its wealth and its power to attack the root of all human suffering. It had to solve the poverty of the world. The Cold War, as my story reveals, only intensified the urgency of this mission. And while hawks like British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his American counterparts argued for military resistance to the Soviet Union, the liberals that I write about worked in earnest to prosecute a different argument, that the United States had to make poverty fighting, not anti-communism, its global mission, not just in Europe, where they won a major victory with the Marshall Plan, but in the emerging periphery, the decolonizing world. Starting in the 1940s, a group of committed liberals began to organize for the sole purpose of creating an anti-militarist vision of US power, what I call an empire of affluence. In the book, which is partly a history of ideas, I show how intellectual innovations in the social sciences supported this political project. But what I really want to dwell on for just the last few minutes of my talk is the organizational work that these liberals, the names would be familiar to anyone who's read a little bit about politics at the mid-century, did that brought this project to fruition. In the 1950s, when their actual political power was at its smallest in nearly 2 decades, remember, these are folks who had a president get reelected 4 times. They were used to Washington. And suddenly in the 1950s, they're in exile. This group worked to develop and prosecute an argument with renewed clarity of thought and purpose. They wrote accessible books like The Affluent Society and The Vital Center to make intelligible for everyday citizens the threat that conspicuous affluence was becoming to the United States and the threat that poverty posed to humanity. They argued that fighting poverty, in these books to everyday people, they argued that fighting poverty was the only way to extend and preserve America's global power and national security. They created new institutional networks within and around the Democratic Party to influence policy development. And they sought out new candidates to carry their message and advance their priorities in elections. By 1960, when the Democratic Party's presidential primary began, this fairly small group of people had amassed enough influence to be seen by John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson as desirable allies. They won the opportunity to take their policy program to the White House. And I argue that their greatest triumph came in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson, whom they had been working to influence for over a decade, agreed to declare a war on poverty at home, too. Shriver, by the way, not coincidentally, had spent much of the late 40s and 50s working as one of these liberals. So ironically, as you no doubt suspect by what you know about how this all turned out, it was a different kind of war, the strategic one in Vietnam, that eroded the political support they had built up to fight global poverty. They made compromises to preserve their war, and eventually those compromises came to haunt them. I tell that story too, but it's not the one I want to dwell on here in the last few minutes of this conversation. Indeed, when I began this project many years ago, I was younger and far more attuned to failure than I am now. As someone who came of age in the 1990s, I bought President Ronald Reagan's version of the war on poverty. We fought a war on poverty, and poverty won. And as someone who then, and still today, identifies as a progressive, I took the New Left critiques of the war on poverty seriously. It wasn't big enough, imaginative enough, or bold enough. But working on this book has helped me see what exceptional circumstances enabled this undertaking. A world that was shaped by a global conflagration that also unleashed the power to end human civilization. Hopefully, we will never see such an age again. So how, in the absence of those dire conditions, do we make a vision of a world free from poverty and injustice politically viable again? How do we make any vision of the future politically viable? Well, despite what makes the moment I write about exceptional, there are, I think, some insights here that might help us think about how to make astonishing things happen again. The astonishing thing that took place between 1941 and 1968 was that a fairly small group of people gathered enough political influence to enact this global program. They did this in their living rooms, especially in the 50s, in classrooms, in meeting rooms, in auditoria, not unlike this one, maybe even in this auditoria, and in the halls of state capitals, international organizations, and yes, those big fancy buildings in Washington, D.C. They developed a bold vision of the world. They diagnosed the problems they saw and thought that had led to the crises that they experienced firsthand, the Depression, the rise of fascism, the catastrophe of war, and they furiously debated and experimented with solutions to those problems. They used their powers of persuasion on the public, on their fellow experts, and most importantly, on politicians. And I want us to recall that they did this facing into the headwinds of political extremism during the Red Scare, which poisoned American political culture, and the early years of the Cold War, in which annihilation, to many, seemed far more likely than survival. They did this partly, to be sure, by making those ultimately devastating compromises that I acknowledged a moment ago. And I talk about that a lot in the book. But they also did this with brio and creativity and optimism, because they wanted the future to look different than the past. Our problems feel more urgent, I know, and the global war on poverty that the characters I write about worked so hard to make happen, if the news about USAID, for instance, is any indication, may be well and truly over. Historical eras come and they go. But if history has one thing to teach us above all, it's that that feeling of urgency can ironically blind us to the work it might actually take to win. What could be more urgent and terrifying than the prospect of mass starvation and nuclear annihilation that faced the world in 1945? John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Chester Bowles, Eunice and Sargent Shriver. It turns out they all found a way to bring pragmatism and patience to their work in spite of uncertainty and fear. They got frustrated. They got overwhelmed. They wondered if they would ever see their plans come to fruition. They sometimes got lost in nostalgia for the good old days when FDR was in the Oval Office. But they never stopped persevering in their efforts to make something big and morally important, visible, legible, and eventually real. So in conclusion, what I want to leave you with is this. We would do well, I think, to remember their example, not because we can or necessarily should try to replicate it, but because at the end of the day, we cannot succeed in solving any of our shared problems, really, and even figuring out what they are, without at least learning from this example. In 1973, 3 disillusioned conservatives formed a think tank called the Heritage Foundation. Throughout the 1980s, its influence on policymaking grew, crowding out more centrist policy approaches to economics and social issues. A lot of the papers in the presidential library here tell some of that story. 2 years ago, with leadership derived from the first administration of President Donald Trump, Heritage drafted this document called Project 2025. And over the past month, we've seen aspects of Project 2025 become executive policy. Some of us, and I'll just speak for myself, may disagree with that project. But we cannot avoid the fact that once again, a small group of committed and creative thinkers did the work to put themselves in a situation where they could make their vision real. For many of us in this room who may believe that Project 2025 betrays our moral values, challenging it might seem at this moment somewhat insurmountable. But the story my book tells suggests that developing a vision of a different kind of future is possible, always, and necessary. It doesn't actually take millions of people. At first, it just takes the focused energy of smart, creative, and clear-minded people. So history teaches us that things have been awful and that efforts to make them better have often been futile. There is no way avoiding that. But it also teaches us that astonishing things are possible. And I put before you my contention that the global war on poverty was an astonishing thing. So for those of you who share my dreams of a more just, more egalitarian, and more compassionate world, I ask, what astonishing things will we work to make possible together? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. As we usually do, mic 3, there we go. As we usually do, I want to welcome questions from the audience. 2 of our fellows have mics on either side, and we would love for you to just raise your hand. I'm going to allow Dr. Jahanbani to kind of point you out, and someone will bring a mic to you, and just speak clearly for all of us so we can hear and be part of that discussion. So I'll kind of get us started, but then I'll let you take over from here, just right back here. You good?
I'm curious about your take on the idea that the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe was less altruistic and more cynical in that the American economy had to shift to consumer goods. There had to be markets for those consumer goods, or the U.S. economy would fall apart. So it was done not to alleviate poverty, but to help build up America or strengthen it.
Yeah, so that's absolutely an argument that some of my guys, and they are mostly guys, were making. But I don't necessarily see that as cynical. I mean, part of what American policymakers learned after the First World War was that a global capitalist economy produced prosperity and did make the quality of life better for people in industrial countries. And I think that they fundamentally believed that they had to create institutions that could preserve and extend that system. And my sense is that the question of altruism, to me, I look at the poverty argument as both altruistic and strategic. In other words, they were constantly making arguments to people like Johnson and Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson, if anybody remembers that name, a guy who ran for president twice. They were constantly making arguments that not only was this good, but it was commonsensical, that it would serve the United States' national interest. So it's actually exactly that convergence of national interest and poverty fighting that I'm interested in. That's the, I think, ideological work that they were doing. They weren't saying that the United States is a Florence Nightingale country that owes this moral obligation to the world. They were saying that if we want to keep what we have figured out, to be the best way of life, one that produces prosperity and democracy simultaneously, then we've got to find a way to make sure that the rest of the world experiences this too. So it's actually exactly that border between cynicism and altruism that I think is a little bit revelatory about what political projects actually are. I hope that answers your question.
It does. The same thing could be said about poverty and widening gap between the rich and the poor. Enabling the poor to buy more is going to help the economy across the board versus it being wealthy concentrated amongst the rich.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, one of the things that my father was a very wise man, and one of the things he always said is that he was from Iran, and he was a nationalist and spent a lot of time thinking about the Cold War. And one of the things he always said is that Americans are a very charitable people but don't really know how to be generous. And I thought that distinction was always really fascinating. And one of the things I found in this research is that it was exactly that sort of notion of charity that these architects of the global war on poverty resisted. There's a wonderful line. Galbraith he's there for some of the early meetings about the Marshall Plan. He's advocating at a sort of political level for the Marshall Plan. And then he winds up leaving government in 1947 for a time. He's mostly getting a little bit concerned about the sort of Cold Warriors taking over the State Department. He decides to go work for Henry Luce at Fortune magazine, and for a liberal, that was quite a move. So he writes this little article called Beyond the Marshall Plan, and it's I don't know if you've read anything by Galbraith, but he was a very tart and charming writer, so I encourage everybody, if there's one old person to look up, it's that guy. His writing was clear and interesting and persuasive. But one of the things he says when he's writing to his editor about this piece is he says, the Marshall Plan is great, and I'm glad we achieved it, but we do spend an awful lot of time talking about how these sad, poor Europeans should be so grateful for all the things we're doing for them. And he basically makes the point you just made, which is the whole argument, is that this is good for everybody. This is not charity. And he specifically says in that piece, generally people, like the neighbor who you give food to and then tell the other neighbors you gave food to them, tends not to wind up being a very good neighbor. So we should probably watch out how we talk about this. So I think it's exactly that place where kind of canny pragmatism was really more present in their minds than we might think. Thank you. Great question.
Since it's on our minds these days, and since it was, I think, also founded by Kennedy, does your book deal with USAID?
It does a little bit. I was really interested in these more, I'm really interested in the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Peace Corps because I'm looking for this sort of network of people. But yeah, USAID becomes another central part of Kennedy's development, sort of program that he especially offers to the Third World as a Cold War strategy. It's funny, so, I'm a historian of international development among the fields I study, and I was on a research trip when the news about USAID came through, and I'm a middle-aged lady. I need to, ration my news intake these days, and so I've been trying to keep myself calm and do my meditations and only read the news a few times every few days, but my phone lit up, and it was all these historians who I've been at conferences with over the years, all of us historians of development, who have all spent most of our academic careers critiquing USAID and everything it stands for. And the conversation was like, are we happy? Are we sad? What do we do? How do we feel? And it was just such an interesting conversation to be a part of as we all thought about like the historical significance of the end of USAID, even though we've seen all the things that we think are wrong with it. I think we came to a consensus that it was a fairly cheap way for the United States to, occupy a certain kind of soft power space that was meaningful in world affairs, and that we are very interested in seeing who will replace the United States in that place. It's, being a historian of US empire too, it's been really interesting to watch kind of moment in which we're apparently rolling that back, and I thought I was excited about that, but living through the end of an empire is less fun than I thought it would be. Yeah, we will have to see. I do not think USAID is coming back. And so an interesting story, actually, President Trump tried to slash USAID's budget during his first administration. And there's a wonderful, I wrote an article about this, there's a wonderful Senate committee hearing in which Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who was a stalwart Trump supporter and really sort of lieutenant in a way, basically just says to the person who's coming to give the administration's budget proposal, like, no, we're not cutting it. This is a very cheap deal for us. We believe in foreign aid. I am with your boss on everything, but not this. And it's like many people were like, what are the places where Republicans have resisted some of the things that the president has tried to do? Weirdly, saving USAID's budget was one of those things. And so the fact that we find ourselves in a situation where USAID is no longer shipping vaccines and food abroad is, I think, quite momentous. So, yeah, it's kind of a remarkable moment.
Since we cast the program as a war on poverty, were you able to identify, for lack of a better term, the weapons in that war that were, number one, what were the weapons that were used in the war, and which weapons were more effective in the war? If you're able to, is it medicine? Is it education? Is it just pure money? Is it manpower in the form of, the Peace Corps, or all of the above, or do we know?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do go into great, some might say, overly abundant detail about that in this thick book, because I am also a historian of ideas, and understanding the intellectual infrastructure of the war on poverty at home and abroad was a secondary kind of project of mine. So, what I was really interested in was like, how did these architects of this undertaking imagine poverty? How did they understand what kind of problem it was? And because so many of them had lived through the Depression and been young men in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, it offered me a really interesting way to look for change over time, which is something historians are interested in. So, okay, the brief version is that there had been, partly because of a sort of revolution in the behavioral sciences in the 1940s and early 1950s, a kind of real efflorescence of new ideas about what caused poverty. And we can tisk at them, and I do extensively in the book, but the kind of core idea that emerged, and I argue it's because these social scientists were, like Oscar Lewis, were doing work in post-colonial societies, not in the US, the solutions that they came to, or the definition of poverty that they came to, was that it really was, first and foremost, a psychological condition, that culture, that existing in a poor place, that existing in poverty, affected a person's sense of what was possible, and even their sense of like investing or saving for the long run, right? Something like that. So this informed a lot of the programs that fall under the rubric of the war on poverty and the global war on poverty. So the Peace Corps, yes, Peace Corps volunteers built wells and, helped teach English to students around the world. But one of the primary activities for Peace Corps volunteers was something called community development. And when you read the manuals for training, what that was basically kind of diagnosing the hopelessness of the people you were embedded with, trying to figure out why they felt they were poor, and then trying to help them identify solutions that they could initiate. And so that happens in the United States in the community action programs that are part of the war on poverty, and it happens abroad in community development programs. And we can say all sorts of things about how kind of faulty that seems, poverty is, I think many of us would agree, primarily a material condition, and people who, get enough food to eat and have decent shelter and who know that their kids are safe can generally do pretty well for themselves. So we can talk about the fact that these were faulty ideas, but I think it's really interesting to see the extent to which the weapons of the war on poverty were really founded on those approaches. And actually, there's a lot of continuity. I mean, still, some of the work USAID was doing, is still community development work. So I think that, were they successful, were they not? It sort of depends. One of the things that happened in the United States, and there's been fantastic scholarship on the fact that the war on poverty actually didn't fail. It just failed at the things we thought it was trying to do. Because one of the things it did do is create a lot of democratic activism in communities that had community action programs. It turned out that if on the south side of Chicago, you created an institution where neighborhood people could get together and talk about their problems, they knew what their problems were. And sometimes their problems were things like unethical landlords or discrimination at work. And if they could organize, which is what the Community Action Program tried to give them a forum for doing, that they could actually advocate for themselves, use the levers of local politics. And this was so successful that mayors in cities like Chicago and New York, called Lyndon Johnson and said, I think you're barking up the wrong tree with this, because I've got a lot of mad poor people, and that's not really my thing. And so I think that you could say that that was extraordinarily successful. One of the things we still see are there are lots of local organizations in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York that actually had their roots as community action programs. So the fact that they still exist and advocate for community people and do the work of challenging power structures, I think is, to me, seems like a sign of success. But hopefully that at least begins to answer your question. And again, so much detail in the book. Too much detail.
I have two quick questions. What countries have eliminated poverty in the world? My second question is, I read an article that says China and Vietnam have eliminated poverty, which are two communist countries. So what countries in the world have eliminated poverty, and have China and Vietnam actually eliminated poverty?
My answer to both those questions is no country has eliminated poverty, because poverty is a relative condition, so it depends on how we define it, right? But also that the fact that China and Vietnam both say this, should make us suspicious of how we might verify those details. Now, it's absolutely true that, as we know, China has experienced extraordinary economic growth and has actually pumped a lot of that economic growth, the benefits of that growth, into creating a middle class and creating social mobility. I think that one of the ways they did that was by embracing capitalism. So, I don't think we can take that as some sort of great victory for communism as an economic theory, right? But also, we know that there are enormous numbers of impoverished people in the People's Republic of China, people who are, employed in conditions that none of us would think are decent. So I think we can't really say that any country has abolished poverty. It just depends on, if we're actually looking at a whole society, right? I think that one of the things that we do have to think about are like the Millennium Development Goals, which were really created this new category called extreme poverty, and used a variety of different diagnostic measures to determine what extreme poverty looked like, and then set goals that the international community agreed to try to improve on those statistics and reduce the number of people in the world living in extreme poverty. And there was some significant success in that area. The fact that the United States is scaling back its commitment to international organizations, we'll all just have to see what it looks like when the U.S. is not at the center of the international community. But yeah, I don't think anybody's quite figured it out. Poverty is also a political problem, not just an economic one. And so I think, I'm not a structuralist or a materialist, but I do think that, it's not really accidental that political power is often concentrated in the hands of people who want more resources, and that they often try to disenfranchise people or are threatened by the political power of people who don't have those material resources. So we got a ways to go. Yeah.
You talked about chief executives having policy and their cabinet members and activists having policy and this kind of thing. Do you speak to, or are you aware of, when it was a war on poverty, Congress declares war and Congress keeps the purse, well, back in that day, maybe not today, Congress kept the purse and Congress doled out the money and made decisions on money. Can you speak, was Congress involved with allocating funds and
Yeah.
budgeting money, and to what extent was the magnitude?
Yeah, Congress was involved. And what's really interesting, and I did do a bit of congressional history, you know, poking around in different figures, papers, and kind of trying to figure out what role they played. There were blocks of senators in particular who really wanted to support the global war on poverty and did so. And part of what happens in 1967, 68 is Johnson loses their support, and he's not great about handling the fact that they disagree with him publicly. And he, you know, alienates them and really convinces them also by that point that he's no longer committed to the war on poverty at home or abroad. So I think one of the things we really can see there is what happens, you know, I told this potentially optimistic story about what a committed group of advocates can do, but when as I referred to the sort of compromises they made, when those compromises erupted into, you know, really paradoxes that people who believed in fighting poverty couldn't really live with, that support did fall away. And their undertaking failed, I think, because of that. So, you know, I'm not saying it's not good to make compromises. I'm saying that especially when you're making an argument for what causes war, making compromises with actual war making might not be the best strategy. And these were all anti-militarist, the people I write about were all explicitly anti-militarist liberals, but they're also all people who tried to make different arguments, but were not willing to directly challenge President Johnson as he became more and more committed to the war in Vietnam. So it's really then that congressional support bleeds out of this effort. That being said, some of the few people who actually hold the torch in the 1970s for fighting poverty at home and abroad are in the Senate and in the House. And so, you know, when Johnson is long gone, and even some of the people I write about, you know, have kind of lost their faith in the undertaking, there are people in Congress who are like, we actually still have to keep funding these programs and we should be, you know, expanding them. And Richard Nixon has to deal with them. And, you know, he struggles to. So they did manage to sort of keep that flame alive for a while. And some of these programs still exist. I mean, again, USAID, which has gone through hell over the last, you know, 50 years, until a couple weeks ago, existed. And that's largely because there were congressional allies who did control the money and did believe that, at least in some scaled back way, these organizations and agencies and institutions should be doing the work they were doing.
Thank you all again for joining us tonight. And but before you leave, just a quick reminder that there might still be some food out there, but there's also books for sale. If you'd like to come back and talk with Dr. Jahanbani, have her sign your book, we would love for you to do that. Please join me once more in just thanking her for being with us tonight.